of Power, live from Washington, D.C.
From Bloomberg's Washington, D.C. studios to our TV and radio audiences worldwide, welcome to Balance of Power. Alongside Emera Omokwe, I'm Joe Matthew. Tonight, the fog of war and accusations of war crimes. Is President Trump now preparing for land strikes, even beyond Venezuela?
I can say this. I want those boats taken out. And if we have to, we'll attack on land also, just like we attack on sea.
Let me be clear. If Trump were to order an attack on land, that would be an act of war, and Congress would invoke the War Powers Act.
The White House invoking the fog of war amid questions today into the chain of command after the administration confirmed a second strike against an alleged drug boat when survivors were in the water. We'll discuss the questions of legality when Republican Senator Rand Paul joins us up ahead. Plus, Comcast upping its bid as it aims to merge NBC Universal with Warner Brothers Discovery, just a day after Netflix put forward its mostly cash offer. The sweetened bids now being negotiated as the clock ticks down to a sale. We'll discuss in tonight's Power Moves. And the race that has national Republicans watching with worry is here today. We'll report on the final 2 hours of voting in Tennessee as Democrats try to send a shockwave to the GOP in a hotly contested special election. But again, we start this evening with new questions surrounding the Trump administration strikes against alleged cartel boats headed for the U.S. The President and Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth aiming to clarify who made the orders for the September 2nd strike against a boat said to be running drugs. Here's what Hegseth had to say about the attack during President Trump's final cabinet meeting of the year.
I watched that first strike live. As you can imagine, at the Department of War, we got a lot of things to do. So I didn't stick around for the hour and 2 hours, whatever, where all the sensitive site exploitation digitally occurs. So I moved on to my next meeting. A couple of hours later, I learned that that commander had made which he had the complete authority to do. And by the way, Admiral Bradley made the correct decision to ultimately sink the boat and eliminate the threat. He sunk the boat, and eliminated the threat. And it was the right call. We have his back. And the American people are safer.
Joining us now with the latest here in Washington is Bloomberg's Wendy Benjaminson, our senior editor. Wendy, it's great to have you. This story continues to evolve, and the cabinet meeting brought a whole new look at what happened potentially. Did the administration put this story to rest here? Because we've got two investigations underway on Capitol Hill.
Yeah, if anything, they poured gasoline on the embers of this story, and it is now burning. I mean, first of all, it's like just this whole thing where Pete Hegseth, the defense secretary, said it was the fog of war and it's all confusing. Let's be clear that the fog of war is an expression from actual combat where both sides are shooting at each other or tearing each other apart, and you get confused about who's doing what. No one was shooting back. So I'm not sure what was confusing to them about that strike. And it really does seem like that the Defense Department and the administration are trying to put this all on Admiral Bradley, who did carry out the order, absolutely. And he killed, I mean, the people he ordered to do that killed those men. But the ultimate responsibility lies with the cabinet secretary, and he is now saying, well, I wasn't in the room, and I'm not going to share the written order with Congress, and it was a spoken order, and all this. And so, if anything, it has only made Congress more apt to really dive into this, as well as everyone else.
The Admiral, we understand, now set to testify on
right.
Thursday. Bloomberg's Wendy Benjaminson, thank you. Wendy, we spoke a short time ago with Republican Senator Rand Paul of Kentucky, who chairs the Senate Homeland Security Committee and also serves on the Foreign Relations Committee. Tried to pursue some of these questions we discussed with Wendy. Asked him about the legality of the Pentagon's actions in Venezuela and whether he thinks they amount to a prelude to war.
I'm very fearful that these boat strikes and the positioning of our ships and our troops right off the coast of Venezuela is a prelude to war. I think that there is a real question of legality. Under the military justice, under the Code of Military Justice, it says that when someone has been incapacitated or shipwrecked, or they're clinging to the wreckage of a boat, that they're out of combat and they're no longer subject to be killed. And so there is a real question, who gave the order and why would they give the order to kill someone who is out of combat? Now, over the weekend, the Secretary of Defense was saying, well, I don't know anything about it. I don't know anything about a second attack. But today, when he was interviewed, he said, well, yes, I left the room for a while. The second attack occurred, and I learned about it when he came back. But why was he telling us this weekend he didn't know anything about a second attack and he had never authorized it? But now that it's come to light, he says, oh, I didn't do it. Somebody else did it. The Admiral did it. So they're all pinning blame on the military guy. But I'm one who tends to give a lot of leeway to the military guy and not so much leeway to the person who gave him the orders. These orders came from the Secretary of Defense, and ultimately he's going to have to accept responsibility. But to my mind, there's a question about whether or not killing people in the first place, who you have no proof that they're armed, you have presented no proof that they're carrying drugs, and that you simply kill them. I think that's outrageous. But now, not only do we kill them, our government is following up by killing them when they're wounded and stranded and of no threat whatsoever, which is, according to our own laws, illegal.
Well, you've illustrated that carefully, Senator. It's Admiral Frank Bradley we're talking about. He's been named by the administration. I don't know if you think it's appropriate that his name is made public before he testifies before the Armed Services Committee on Thursday. But I guess the question now is raised, where does the buck stop? Is it with the Admiral, the Defense Secretary, or the Commander-in-Chief?
I think it's, to me, amazing that anybody in the public accepts this. The idea that we would make an accusation. We will simply accuse someone, and then they are found guilty without any kind of process. We asked the Coast Guard for specific statistics off the coast of Venezuela, and they said of boats that have been intercepted off of the coast before we came up with this blow them to smithereens policy, we used to interdict them. And of the boats that we interdicted off the coast of Venezuela, about 1 in 4, 21% to be exact, were not carrying drugs. That would mean if you're going to blow up all of the boats off the coast that look like drug boats or that you're suspicious for, 21% of the time you'd be killing innocent people. So I think it's outrageous that anybody would countenance this kind of activity. And I'm surprised that I seem to be one of the few people who seem to be alarmed at this. But I think it's unconscionable. It's wrong on any level to kill people with no proof that they are engaged in combat at all with your country.
Well, so should Pete Hegseth be fired?
There has to be an investigation, and I am glad that for a change there is a bipartisan push from the Armed Services Committee to get to the bottom of this. So there'll be an investigation. I think he needs to be asked under oath, did you give the order to kill any survivors? And if you didn't give the order, what was the order? Why did the Admiral think that he was supposed to kill people clinging to wreckage? And the idea that these people were still a threat, it's a debate whether they were ever a threat. They're on a motorboat 2,000 miles from our coast. If you want to take that motorboat to the closest point of entry in Miami, you probably have to fill it up 20 times. These motorboats can't go 2,000 miles on a tank of gas. If there was drugs on board, they may be going to other countries, but probably not to the U.S. So the whole thing is just remarkable that in our country we would allow this to happen.
Senator Schumer has asked for footage of these strikes to be released. Is that something that you would support?
Yes. We need to see the footage. We need to hear the audio. The Secretary of Defense has now said that he left the room. That's fine. But the whole idea is the Admiral's not just making these decisions without an order. The order came from the Secretary of Defense. And then I hear some of my colleagues in the hallway just saying, oh, no big deal, we do this all the time. Whenever we bomb people, we just do a second tap on them, man. If they're moving, we go back and hit them again. Well, if it's soldiers with guns shooting our soldiers, I'm fine with that. But this is a pretense of a war. They've just said, oh, we call these people in these boats narco-terrorists so we can kill them without any kind of proof, without any kind of justification, because we say so, because we say it's a war. This is insane. This isn't a war. These people we don't even know if they're armed. We've killed 80 people. Are any of them armed? What are their names? What is it they're transporting? All these people going off saying, oh, fentanyl's killing people. I know people who died of fentanyl. I have a great deal of sympathy. I know a family lost 2 sons to fentanyl. I have sympathy for that. There's no evidence there's any fentanyl on this boat. There's no evidence that any fentanyl comes from Venezuela. Zero. there is fentanyl come out of Mexico, but since we're blowing these boats up, maybe we're taking our eye off the border in Mexico. So the whole thing is a pretense and a prelude to war in Venezuela, and I hope it doesn't happen.
Senator, you've said previously that you've received not one briefing on Venezuela. In your eyes, does the administration have a coherent strategy on this issue? And how does it square with the president and the administration's America First posture, this idea that they were going to keep America out of ever-increasing foreign entanglements?
The one thing I've always liked about Donald Trump, and the reason I've supported him and still do support him, is that I think his instincts towards less intervention and less foreign war have been sincere. He's been against the Iraq War for several decades, before it happened and after it happened. He was against the war in Libya that Obama took us into. So those were legitimate ideas. They're a legitimate part of America First. But this idea of invading Venezuela, I think, comes from the Secretary of State, who's long wanted regime change there. Now, if you could wave a wand and have regime change where there's adversaries we don't like, we would do it for China. We would do it for Colombia. We would do it for all the countries that have tin-pot socialist dictators. But we don't do that because the end result of regime change often is more chaos, or chaos worse even than the authoritarianism they live under.
Well, I'm getting confused here, Senator, because there was also a pardon that the administration announced this week. Former Honduras President Juan Orlando Hernandez, who was convicted for pushing hundreds of tons of cocaine into this country. If we're concerned about the drug trade in America, why would the administration pursue this pardon?
Oh, didn't they tell you? He's not a narco-terrorist. And I'm being facetious.
Well, I heard the president say today that it was a Biden hoax, that it was Biden overreach, so you don't support this pardon.
Well, so here's the thing. Here's the thing. If they say he's not a narco-terrorist, he's not a threat to America, and maybe he was falsely accused. And I say that facetiously because it gets to the point of if they label you a narco-terrorist, they can kill you without trial. But if they say you're not a narco-terrorist, you can be given a pardon even though you have been convicted, even though he's gloated over all the people he's loaded with drugs, including some who have probably and inevitably have died in our country. But he's okay because the administration does not label him a narco-terrorist. It gets to the whole problem of this. So I have brought forward with Senator Kaine on a couple of occasions, and will do again, the idea that we have to debate whether this is war. There is a lower standard for rules of engagement in war, but they say it's not war. But then they say, well, it kind of is war because we've labeled them narco-terrorists, and they are designated to be foreign terrorists, so you can kill them without any proof because they're enemy combatants. But if we try to have a vote in Congress as to whether it's war, say, oh, we can't have that because this is our prerogative. But then you get into the lunacy of, well, Orlando Hernandez is not a narco-terrorist, but these guys who we don't know their name and we presented no proof, they're narco-terrorists. It's absolutely and utterly insane.
Senator, Republicans have often been hesitant to push back on the administration's policy moves. How optimistic are you that Republicans will be able to come together, find some unity on this issue, and provide oversight on this issue of the boat strikes and the posture towards Venezuela?
I'm encouraged that the Arms Services Committee is going to do an investigation. That is a bipartisan thing. The Republican Chairman Wicker is going forward with an investigation. I hope they will demand the actual footage and the audio of what happened during that strike. These are strikes that are going out without the approval of Congress. At the very least, after the fact, they ought to show us the actual video, the actual footage, and the actual audio, and we should hear under oath from the Admiral that gave the order and hear under oath from the Secretary of Defense.
I've got to ask you about health care. Senator, just a couple of hours ago, you probably saw this, the president posting on Truth Social what appears to be a screen grab of a text that you sent him. Is that real, just for starters? Is that a text that you sent the president?
I did, and I've engaged with the president because I've worked with him before and still want to work with the president. In the first administration, I engaged with him on something called association health plans. These are group plans that individuals can buy. So, for example, the biggest problem we have in healthcare is that if you're a small business person, say you're an accountant and you have 3 employees, you want to buy insurance, you go into the individual market and you have no leverage. And if one of your employees gets cancer or you get cancer, they jack up the risk for your really small risk pool. Instead, what I'm proposing is you should be allowed to go anywhere you want to buy insurance across state lines, including places like Costco, Sam's Club, Amazon. And then if you became one of millions of people buying insurance, Amazon or Costco would negotiate directly with the insurance company and say, look, I got 10 million people who want insurance, and I'm negotiating for them. And all of a sudden, they become the largest entity in America, and they'll drive the prices down. The problem with Obamacare, although well-intended to help people, is when you give people money to buy insurance as insurance rates are going up, you say, I'll give you $1,000, then I'll give you $5, then I'll give you $10. You just keep chasing the rates higher because you're artificially increasing the demand, and the price just goes higher. It hasn't worked. So originally, President Obama said prices will go down $2,500 within, I don't know, a year or two of Obamacare, and the exact opposite has happened. So if we continue to do this, it won't get any better. We're chasing in our tail. We're chasing inflation. And so what we need is leverage and to allow the marketplace to work to bid down prices. My plan would also let everybody have an HSA, and it would let you purchase your health insurance out of an HSA. So as you save money and you're able to purchase your insurance out of it, there would be a possibility, particularly over time, that you might be able to accrue enough money that you would be able to get larger and larger deductible because you have a big savings account to cover your deductible.
Just to understand for our viewers and listeners here, Senator, do you need the president, now that you're pitching him on this, to say which plan, yours or Bill Cassidy's, should be pursued here? And will this get a floor vote when that happens?
It's the debate. We're having this debate right now within our caucus. Others in my caucus want to take the Obamacare money and stick it in your HSA. That, to me, is another form of Obamacare, and I'm not really for that. I'm for letting you save your own money in your HSA and letting 90% of people who don't have an HSA get one, and then let you negotiate through a buying co-op like Amazon to get lower prices.
Republican Senator Rand Paul of Kentucky with us on Balance of Power in a conversation earlier today. Wall Street staged a cautious rebound today with the S&P 500 stuck in a tight trading range despite a bit of a rally in crypto. For all the details, turn to power moves now with Bloomberg's Romaine Bostick, who is live at World Headquarters in New York. Romaine?
Yeah, Joe, if there's been any real barometer of risk sentiment across financial markets over the past couple of months, it's actually been what we've been seeing in cryptocurrencies. Remember, we saw Bitcoin, the world's largest cryptocurrency, have a drawdown of almost 30% from its most recent high back in early October. It got a little bit of its mojo back today with a slight bid here, higher back above that 91,000 level. But there's been a proxy out there for Bitcoin, frankly, a proxy, if you will, for all of cryptocurrency, if you will. And that is the company Strategy, the formerly known as MicroStrategy, formerly, well, I guess still a software company. But a few years ago, it made a big bet on Bitcoin and that it can be basically a leverage Bitcoin play. And it did that to phenomenal effect. The shares had a phenomenal run over the past 3 years, but they are down more than 60% from the most recent all-time high set back in July. They got a little bit of a pop today, up about 8%, as the CEO of Strategy came out right here on this network with Katie Greifeld, defended their decision to continue with this strategy, and more importantly, made it clear that they have enough cash on hand to pay out their dividend. And that has been the big concern here, a big dividend payment due coming up early next year. They say basically they have the money. We talked to another analyst, Mark Palmer, who also said that he thinks they have the money and that a lot of investors right now just don't seem to get it. But we'll have to keep an eye on this, Joe, as we get deeper into the next week and beyond. Because remember, we have a big Fed meeting, and that's going to play a big role in the direction of cryptocurrencies as well. It's going to play a big role, as you know, in the direction of Treasury rates. And right now, you have a Fed that is deeply divided, Joe, on the direction in which they want to take benchmark rates.
That strategy chart is something to behold. Romaine, thank you. Bloomberg's Romaine Bostick in New York. Coming up, President Trump's special envoy, Steve Witkoff, wrapping his meeting with Vladimir Putin today. What Witkoff's Russian counterpart now says happened during that meeting. When we're back on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.
We're trying to get that settled. I've settled 8 wars this would be the ninth. And our people are over in Russia right now to see if we can get it settled. Not an easy situation. Let me tell you what a mess. It's a war that never would have happened if I were president.
This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio alongside Amara Omokwe. I'm Joe Matthew. Thanks for joining us. That, of course, the president earlier today during his final cabinet meeting of the year. It topped 2 hours, confirming their special envoy Steve Witkoff's visit to Moscow. Witkoff wrapping up his meeting with Vladimir Putin a short time ago as the U.S. presses Ukraine to accept a peace deal. Meantime, Vladimir Putin claiming Russia has taken control of a key Ukrainian city in the country's eastern Donetsk region, while also warning that Russia may start striking the ships of countries supporting Ukraine if a surge in attacks on Moscow's tanker fleet continues, according to local media. Joining us now with the latest, Bloomberg's Eric Martin, who covers the State Department. Want to hear more about what came from this meeting today, Eric, and we've got some headlines crossing the terminal. It lasted almost 5 hours. Did they produce anything?
Joe, a marathon meeting, what we're hearing from Yuri Ushakov, Kremlin aide, who is speaking to Russian press, spoke moments ago, talking about how this was a productive meeting and a useful meeting, but that no compromise has yet been reached. Of course, these have been fraught negotiations because as the pendulum swings to one side, as it swings more towards the priorities of Ukraine, it swings away from those of Russia, and we need to see some kind of a balance struck in the middle in order for this to move forward and for us to get a ceasefire, let alone a more comprehensive peace agreement. So, as you said, we've had all eyes on Moscow today in these meetings, which were more than 5 hours. We were seeing some reporting that Steve Witkoff, Envoy Witkoff, has now gone to the U.S. Embassy in Moscow. One would expect that he would be briefing Washington and dialing back to the White House to share the results and his conclusions from the process today, and then to see where this goes in the days ahead. Does he go and meet with the Ukrainian side? What's the next step here? We're still waiting for clarity on that.
So no compromise today. So how optimistic should we be for progress in these negotiations, and what comes next?
Depends who you ask. We saw Secretary of State and National Security Advisor Rubio speaking now about 10 days ago and coming out of Geneva, saying that it was one of the most productive days in this entire process, and he was feeling optimistic. We had seen additional reporting that Ukraine was close to accepting the proposal and that Ukraine would be willing, of course, to accept a ceasefire. And the real question is, and we've seen this flagged by some of the U.S. allies in Europe, is they have doubts and skepticism that Russia really does want to end this war. And so their concern is that they see Russia trying to trade some kind of Ukrainian retreat from territorial positions for a ceasefire, but without security guarantees and something that would leave Ukraine vulnerable for Russia to come back and take another bite out of this in 6 months, 12 months, or some years.
We've only got about 30 seconds, Eric. We should note Jared Kushner was also in this meeting, correct? Is he working on behalf of the administration in the same fashion as Steve Witkoff?
Absolutely. That's a good point, Joe. Jared, we saw him certainly involved in the Gaza process, and we had heard about his involvement in the 28-point plan and talks, and so it seems that now that Gaza is relatively resolved as far as a ceasefire, that he's moved on to working on this intractable Ukraine issue.
Well, we're going to keep our eyes on Truth Social for more details on what happened in that meeting. Bloomberg's Eric Martin, thank you so much for the readout. Coming up, lawmakers on the Hill questioning whether the administration's boat strikes outside of Venezuela conform with the law of war. We'll discuss with Elizabeth Wydra of the Constitutional Accountability Center next on Bloomberg.
The Trump administration already showed its goodwill, and so based on our communication, so we are confident in the near future. Yeah, we can just have a visit to the Latin American countries, by way of the United States.
It's Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio alongside Amara Omokwe. I'm Joe Matthew in Washington. That was the Taiwanese foreign minister this morning in an exclusive interview with Bloomberg. sharing that the Taiwan government is confident the Trump administration will allow their president to make a U.S. stopover. These remarks come as tensions have escalated between China and Japan over comments the Japanese prime minister made about Taiwan in recent weeks. And joining us now with her insights into this and more, Jenny Welch from Bloomberg Economics. Jenny, it's great to have you back. Is President Trump about to take a page from the Pelosi playbook here and make people upset on the other side of the world?
I think much remains to be seen. It seemed from that interview that Foreign Minister Lin gave that he was just kind of commenting broadly about the state of the relationship with the United States. It doesn't seem like a transit is necessarily formally planned or in the works at the moment. Although Taiwan's president does typically make a visit to partners in the Western Hemisphere at least once a year, and he hasn't done that yet. So a visit is overdue, and normally, even just for sake of convenience, it's usual for him to transit through the United States during that time.
The U.S. and China are still working to finalize the trade deal. How would a stopover here potentially complicate that?
Well, in the past, even though this has been a long-held practice by Taiwanese leaders for decades, Beijing has voiced their disapproval and their frustration with it. And earlier this year, there were reports that the United States essentially encouraged Taipei to hold off on a transit, in part because of ongoing negotiations with Beijing over a trade deal. I will say, since the meeting in Busan, the United States has announced at least 2 arms sales to Taiwan, one that was more parts and replacement pieces, another that was a pretty large set of equipment, NASAMs, which are advanced military weaponry. So I think what that suggests is there is the possibility for continued engagement along the lines of what we've seen in the past. But there is always the question with President Trump about where he stands on Taiwan or on these other issues on a day-to-day basis. There were reports last week that part of his phone call to the Japanese prime minister might have been about China's concerns about comments she's made about Taiwan. And if that's true, that would seem to suggest he's really focused on maintaining this truce and avoiding any friction with China, either directly or through U.S. partners.
You're visiting Taiwan with a big delegation and the optics that come with it was a pastime for a while for lawmakers here in a very different political environment in Washington. Following Pelosi's trip, there were many other delegations. That are lawmakers still traveling there, or are they doing it more quietly?
Oh, absolutely. No, they're definitely still traveling there.
They're just not advertising it.
They are. I think there was just, a slight hiccup with the government shutdown that probably kept them here in the United States not traveling as much. But it's definitely still a common practice. It just tends to happen around recesses and other times when they have the opportunity to travel. But it's one of the top destinations for lawmakers still, and there's bipartisan consensus on support for Taiwan. Very strong still in Congress.
Thanks for joining, as always. Jennifer Welch, Bloomberg Economics. We thank you, Jenny. Key U.S. senators will question Admiral Frank Bradley, suddenly a household name, about his role in ordering the second strike against a suspected drug trafficking boat in the Caribbean. The White House confirming that the U.S. military ordered that second strike and said the order came from Bradley himself. The president then adding this earlier today.
I can say this. I want those boats taken out, and if we have to, we'll attack on land also, just like we attack on sea.
The lawmakers are seeking to ascertain whether the boat strikes conform with the law of war, the military's code of justice and international law. Joining us now here in our Washington bureau with her insight is Elizabeth Wydra, president of the Constitutional Accountability Center. Elizabeth, it's great to see you. Welcome back to Bloomberg TV and radio. I know you're not an expert on maritime law, but with what you've heard here today, are suggestions or even questions about war crimes, possible war crimes, appropriate?
Given what we know about the facts of this second strike, there are serious legal questions here. And that's even if you take the Trump administration at their claim that we are in an armed conflict with these drug cartels, which a lot of people say, we are not in an armed conflict as that is defined under policy and law. But even taking their claim that we are in an armed conflict, this still raises serious legal concerns because the facts as we know them are that these survivors of the first strike were, essentially clinging on to remnants of the boat. And in that situation, the law of naval warfare, the law of armed conflict would say that those people, they're not a threat. They're not an imminent threat. So there's not a self-defense issue. And rather that they would get protection under the law of the sea. And so there we're talking about, even if we are in an armed conflict, that could be a war crime. And when you have customary international law, that is incorporated into U.S. domestic law, it could also be murder.
Wow.
Which is that's a serious thing.
Yeah.
We heard the president today during the cabinet meeting raise the possibility of land strikes. How serious of an escalation would land strikes be in this situation?
Well, certainly, I think to the Venezuelan government and the Venezuelan people, it would seem to be very significant. I think when it comes to the legal issues raised from this second strike, honestly, you would have similar concerns if it were on land or on sea. Generally, the law of armed conflict doesn't allow you to sort of, have, take no quarter strikes where, if there are survivors like this who are not posing a threat, you don't just wipe everybody out without there being consequences. And whether those consequences come from congressional oversight, which obviously under our constitutional democracy, that is Congress's role. So I'm pleased to see that there are talks of investigating and Congress taking on that constitutional oversight role, or through the Court of Military Justice when it comes to the Admiral who is potentially involved here, or because Secretary Hegseth is a civilian himself, legal consequences could come through the U.S. legal system.
Well, there are a lot of questions about evidence in this case. The press secretary earlier today at the Pentagon had said they are 100% confident that these are drug smuggling vessels. We haven't seen the evidence, though, and the Admiral's about to testify before the Armed Services Committees on Thursday, and I'm sure they'll have some difficult questions for him. But if you were preparing a case, if you were going into a courtroom, what questions would you have and what evidence would you need to see?
Oh, there are so many questions.
Yeah.
I mean, first of all, as you said, we have not really seen a lot of evidence that these boats are smuggling drugs, that they are smuggling drugs that are related to the fentanyl crisis that the president has invoked, that are aimed at the United States. And even if they were drug smuggling boats, you still would have legal procedures and protocol that you need to follow when you are engaging in deadly strikes.
Like boarding the vessels.
Yes, I mean, normally this sort of interdiction of drug smugglers would be exactly, that they would seek to stop the boat, board the vessel, and we've seen before that in many cases when they do that, they find that they are not actually drug smugglers. So, having that, semblance of due process before engaging in deadly action, where you're basically judge, jury, and executioner all in one moment. But even if they are drug smugglers, again, the questions are whether what happened in this particular case is illegal under international law, and whether it violates constitutional safeguards where, we only allow the executive to engage in these sorts of military strikes under very limited circumstances. So if this is a longer term, more involved conflict, then Congress really should be getting involved in its constitutional duty as the one that declares war.
We saw the president recently issue a pardon for former Honduran President Juan Hernandez, who was serving a prison sentence for drug trafficking at the same time that the U.S. is striking these boats over drug trafficking. I wonder, is that an appropriate use of the pardon power to pardon this former Honduran president?
Well, it certainly raises a question of, I guess, consistent intent. We've seen President Trump through tariff policies against Canada and Mexico, which he has said he's put in place in part because of the drug crisis of fentanyl crossing the borders. And of course, what we've been talking about now, these strikes on the boats that he says are drug smugglers. So then to pardon someone who has been convicted of, very serious, massive drug smuggling efforts doesn't really seem to be consistent. And, I think that's something that the American people should really be watching because, we want our elected leaders of every political stripe to be held accountable to the rule of law. And the pardon power is something that the president has broad discretion in using. But, the political consequences could come in addition to, what legal consequences might come from the actual decision to order those strikes. But the pardon power is very broad. The president has discretion, but whether it sits well with the American people is a separate question.
I never thought we'd be sitting here having this conversation with Elizabeth Wydra because with your experience before the Supreme Court, that's typically what we're talking about. And we're certainly waiting for some major rulings here. The next big one that's on our radar, and for many investors, is the ruling on President Trump's tariff regime. Well, that could come at any moment, we're told. What are your expectations on timing, and what should we be looking for when that rolls out?
Absolutely. So normally big cases like this take, months and months. Sometimes, we'd be talking about before the term ends in June. But the Supreme Court really fast-tracked the tariff case. It went from initial request for review to argument in a matter of weeks, which might not seem super fast to the average observer, but in Supreme Court timing, that is lightning fast. So most of us are expecting to get a ruling before the end of the year. So given that it's December, here we are. I think the big questions will be, does the Supreme Court apply this doctrine that it has created that says when the executive does something that has broad political or economic consequences for the nation, it needs to be done under an express delegation from Congress. It can't be this kind of interpretation of congressional law. And clearly Congress has not said you may apply tariffs in this exact situation. And so if the court applies that doctrine, which it did to President Biden's student loan policy, for example, student loan forgiveness, then I think the tariffs fall. If they don't apply it, then I think it's a more open question about whether the tariffs survive. Certainly at oral argument, it seemed as if the history behind the statutes that the president has been invoking to justify the tariff policies, the justices seem to find some holes, some pretty big holes in the administration's argument. But, I think we're going to look to see what Chief Justice Roberts does, what Justice Amy Coney Barrett and Justice Gorsuch, Justice Kavanaugh, where they stand on this issue.
Well, it's awfully important to us here, and you'll be the first call we make when that lands. I'll just warn you now. Elizabeth Wydra, president of the Constitutional Accountability Center. It's great to have you back, and we thank you for the insights. Coming up, Michael and Susan Dell announcing that they're giving more than $6 billion to the Trump accounts for kids. We'll bring you those details ahead, and we'll continue our conversation on the legality of those Venezuelan boat strikes when we assemble our political panel. It's all next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. It's Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio alongside Amara Omokwe. I'm Joe Matthew. Thanks for being with us. We'll have more on the Venezuela boat strikes and the chain of command when we convene our political panel next. First, the stories we're watching in today's Power Brief. Federal prosecutors officially charged the National Guard shooting suspect with first-degree murder and assault with intent to kill for shooting the two guardsmen stationed in the nation's capital last week. Prosecutors say that surveillance video captured the suspect opening fire on the National Guard members, striking both immediately, and he kept shooting as they fell. The suspect pleading not guilty via video cam from his hospital bed. This case has drawn scrutiny to Afghan evacuees admitted to the U.S. and is being used by President Trump to argue for a significant expansion of a travel ban.
And on this Giving Tuesday, a historic donation. Just a short time ago, Michael and Susan Dell pledged to give over $6 billion to the Treasury Department to build on the Invest America initiative created under the One Big Beautiful Bill. Michael Dell spoke about the historic investment on Bloomberg this afternoon. Take a listen.
We do think that this will be catalytic and that more philanthropists and companies will join us over time. And again, this is a platform for the future of these children.
Under the program, the government will automatically seed designated Trump accounts with $1,000 for every child born between 2025 and 2028. The Dell's gift will put $250 towards an additional 25 million children 10 and under, not already covered under the initiative. Joining us now with their reaction to these stories and more, this evening's political panel. Here they are. Matt Gorman, Chief Communications Officer at Targeted Victory, our Republican strategist, alongside Megan Hayes, Democratic strategist, former special assistant to President Biden. Great to see you both here. I think we were all born too late to enjoy the money, so we'll go on to other matters. We tried our best. Big doings today at the White House. That cabinet meeting was over 2 hours long, and it was not a coincidence, I'm assuming, that the president first went to Pete Hegseth, who found himself the center of this storm that is still raging over the second and maybe more, according to some reports, strikes against this alleged drug boat in Venezuela. So tell us where you are here, Matt. We've got 2 investigations going on Capitol Hill and an administration that wants this to end now. Did they put this to bed today, or does this make it worse?
Doesn't seem like it. The senators of note, Joni Ernst, Roger Wicker, and others have called for more oversight of this, more investigation of this, which is, look, it's a little surprising, right? You've seen a lot of times in the Senate, they've been very deferential to President Trump and his nominees. So Ernst was somebody that was notable to me, as you remember, about a year ago. She had a little bit of uncertainty about Pete Hegseth before she finally said she would vote for him. I'm curious if those feelings come back in the weeks to come. And I'm sure between now and the next couple weeks, Pete Hegseth will have to go in front of Congress and talk about this. What did he know? What was the chain of command? Who made those calls with the drug boat?
How do you imagine this Venezuela situation is playing with President Trump's base? Is this something that you think the base welcomes, given that President Trump pretty much ran on putting America first and not getting us into more foreign interventions?
I think it remains to be seen. I've talked to folks that said this is a winner for us, possibly in Florida. I've also talked to folks that say, this might not be what they need to be focusing on. Affordability is the one that's going to be a big issue. Certainly we're seeing it in Tennessee. We saw it last month. We might see it again, most likely next year. So I'm very curious to see how they really start to tackle affordability in lieu of things that will come up. Venezuela, Iran over the summer. You'll have these things bubble up. But how do they stay focused on what's affordability?
Megan, you know what it's like to help manage communications in a White House. The way this was rolled out was really something. Yesterday, the press secretary put forth the name Admiral Frank Mitch Bradley during the White House press briefing. Suddenly a household name. He has yet to testify, presumably behind closed doors, to the Armed Services Committee. But he, I guess, either made the order or pulled the trigger here. There are questions about accountability and chain of command. Now we're in the cabinet room with the president, Pete Hegseth, the first person he went to, as I mentioned, who made it clear that he watched this attack live. What are Democrats going to do with this as Tim Kaine accuses the administration of war crimes?
Yeah, I mean, what's incredible is the story has changed over the last 72 hours or so. First, it was, the whole story is made up. None of it happened. Then it's, no, this was a double tap strike that they mentioned yesterday from Caroline Leavitt. Hegseth said right after it happened, he was in the room. Now he's saying he walked out of the room. He didn't see this part of the shooting take place. And that Admiral just went right under that bus. They had no problem in throwing him under the bus there. So I think that all of these things raise questions. And when you start getting people to testify, the Admiral won't be the only one called up to Congress. I think that this is where Republicans are really going to have to decide whether they're going to bend the knee to Trump or whether they're going to stand firm like some of these senators are, because I think the American people are watching, and I think that these things really matter to voters, and these are the types of things that how people lose their reelections.
Do you see support for Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth starting to wane? The explanations for these boat strikes, the signal gate controversy that we had earlier in the year. How are you assessing how he's doing on the job?
I mean, he's terrible at the job. He's completely incompetent, but that's a Democratic perspective. I think he's totally over his skis here to start with and should have never been put in the job. But I think that my view, and the more that Democrats come out and the more people come out, Donald Trump digs in. Donald Trump loves his loyalty, loves his defensiveness that you saw today in the in the cabinet room during the meeting today. So, I think that with the base, his defensiveness and the way he acts plays well. But for the American people and for the rest of the country, I'm not so sure that it plays well. But the problem is Donald Trump is really the only one that can get him out of his position, and I'm not sure he's willing to do that.
We spoke earlier with Rand Paul on the program. I don't know if it's possible to hear a piece of that now, because he appears to be, one of the only Republicans really going after the administration on this. The Armed Services Committees are investigating these strikes. But Rand Paul kind of sounds like a man on an island when you consider the fact that he is a Republican, and that's not new for him. Listen to what he said earlier this hour on Balance of Power.
There has to be an investigation, and I am glad that for a change there is a bipartisan push from the Armed Services Committee to get to the bottom of this. So there be an investigation. I think he needs to be asked under oath, did you give the order to kill any survivors? And if you didn't give the order, what was the order? Why did the Admiral think that he was supposed to kill people clinging to wreckage?
Even if these committees don't like what they hear, the the president's Department of Justice isn't going to make a case against Pete Hegseth or the commander-in-chief, right?
Yeah, it's about
is this already over?
Rand Paul's opinion of Pete Hegseth is about as relevant as Megyn and her party's opinion of Pete Hegseth. They've been waiting for some time. Look, you saw this with Rand over the summer and criticizing some of the stuff Pete Hegseth said. Also, let's face it, the Kentucky Republicans, between Tom Massey and Rand Paul, and even to sometimes Mitch McConnell, not the most popular Republicans, whether it's in the Senate chamber, certainly not in the White House right now. So I'll put it this way. If you want credibility among some of the criticism, Rand Paul's probably not the person the White House is going to be taking note from.
He gets no credit for speaking truth to power?
He speaks a lot of truth in his mind.
Okay.
But he's a bit of a squeaky wheel on a lot of things, including the government shutdown. So I think people tend to tune him out.
You mentioned the question of affordability.
Yeah.
We have a special election in Tennessee, and that affordability issue is obviously playing a big role in that election. Can you talk about how Republicans are thinking about the affordability issue and messaging around that, given that Democrats seem to be gaining traction?
Well, you'd think affordability would be the focus of the election, but when the Democrats picked an incredibly flawed candidate who brings AOC and Kamala Harris and Al Gore, remember Al Gore, into the district, suddenly the affordability issue becomes a backseat to wanting to defund the police and talk about how much you hate Nashville, hate your district. So, Megyn and I have been through a lot of these. And these special elections, they're unique beasts. But the key is, if you're the underdog, you need to be a good candidate. You can't be as nimble as a bull in China shop, which she is when she goes on these TV shows and gets asked about her past positions. And so, look, it's closer than it should be. I'll give you that. But Afton Bain, or Ben, whatever her name is, not doing any favors to make it closer. I'll put it that way.
Afton Bain, indeed, apparently not a big country music fan, according to President Trump. Megyn, bring us inside this race. Emerson College shows this a 2-point race. Even if the Republican wins here, you're declaring moral victory tomorrow morning, right?
I think the fact that we've been talking about this race for over a week and how close it is in a Trump plus 22 district is an incredibly telling sign that the American people are tired of Donald Trump and the Republican policies. And I think that the affordability issue needs to be discussed. But the one thing that I think that this is really important for, I think I don't think she will win. I think that she'll probably lose in single digits, which will be a huge accomplishment for Democrats in this district particularly. But I think that the issue that Democrats should hold on to here is this widens the map for the midterms. This makes other districts that are not considered frontline districts much more appealing if you get the right candidates. To Matt's point, you get the right candidates, you will have more opportunities to take back the House than I think the Democrats really suspected that they would have maybe 6 months ago, which I do think is a victory for Dems leading into the midterms.
Wow, a district that President Trump won by 22 points. Matt Gorman and Megyn Hayes, great conversation. Thank you for a great panel. And check out the Washington Edition newsletter to unpack everything we talked about tonight. You can find it on the terminal and online. Thank you for joining us on Balance of Power, as always. Alongside Amara Omokwe, I'm Joe Matthew, as we keep our eyes on Capitol Hill, where they are lighting the congressional Christmas tree this evening. We'll wait for the White House to follow on. It looks pretty nice, doesn't it?
It does.
Thanks for joining us this evening, as always. On Balance of Power, this is Bloomberg.